Can you talk about racism as being a core or fundamental piece of capitalism and how that's started and how that's being used today? Many of us talk about capitalism, but we sort of don't include the race part as being an integral component of it.
Well, as I tell the story, and once again, it's embedded in my 17th century book, and it's also reflected in the works of the Nigerian scholar Joseph Inakori of University of Rochester, and embedded in the work of the late Caribbean scholars Walter Rodney and Eric Williams. Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery. Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. As I tell the story, what happens is that at a certain point, you have a beheading of the monarchy in London, which is taking place at the same time that their successors, led by Oliver Cromwell, or ousting the Spanish from Jamaica. And at the same time, in Brazil, you see another Protestant power, speaking of the Dutch, being ousted from their temporary sojourn in Brazil, with the Portuguese Catholics making a comeback in their colony. And what happens is that many of those who had been in Brazil, who happened to be Jewish, by the way, who had been involved in sugar production in Brazil, flee en masse to Jamaica, because, as noted, with this concept of whiteness, the Protestants, the scrappy underdogs, were able to incorporate many of those who happened to be Jewish, even though, as I said, with regard to London, they'd expelled the Jewish population centuries earlier. With those folks migrating to Jamaica, you have the rise of the sugar boom, so-called, which leads to fabulous wealth, because sugar is seen not only as a way to sweeten one's tea, but as a kind of miracle drug, creating enormous wealth that's then poured into shipbuilding, which is used to transport more Africans across the Atlantic, more settlers across the Atlantic, producing a working class of shipyard workers, leading to this circle devoid of virtue, involving production of great amounts of wealth being poured into production. And therein you begin to see the seeds of capitalism. And I should mention, of course, that in my book further, I talk about how that leads inevitably to an expansion of the African slave trade with the rise of the Royal African Company in the 1670s. And then the bourgeois, or the merchant class, I should say, make another comeback in the 1680s, because recall that Oliver Cromwell's tenure was rather short-lived, and the monarchs make a comeback. And then by the 1680s, their wings are clipped, uh, creating this present monarchy, where they have incredible wealth, but are not necessarily ruling, speaking of today's King Charles. And what happens is that the Royal African Company, which has been under the thumb of the monarch, uh, you have that disrupted with the era that I call in my book free trade in Africans. That is to say, with merchants entering the African slave trade in great numbers, with return on investment of an eye-watering 1,700% in some cases, which creates more wealth, involving more enslavement of Africans, more ships, etc., in this circle devoid of virtue. And therein you begin to see the rise of capitalism. You begin to see also the rise of slave revolts, particularly in the Caribbean, which, as I tell the story, leads to the Great Trek from the Caribbean to the North American mainland up until about 1750. London sees the Caribbean as more valuable than the North American mainland, and even after 1750, for that matter. And of course, coming to the mainland brings no surcease. There's still slave revolts. 1712, New York City; 1739, South Carolina; 1741, New York City. Of course, the settlers try to do an end run around this process by establishing a so-called all-white colony in Georgia in 1733. But alas, that doesn't work. because it basically imports class contradictions between and amongst Europeans across the Atlantic. These settlements were supposed to be a way to circumvent class contradictions, not recreate them in the New World, so to speak. And not to mention the fact that South Carolina borders Georgia, and many of the settlers were slyly importing African labor, even though they were not supposed to be doing so. And ultimately, of course, we know the story since per the 2010 census, Georgia had more Black people than any other state in the USA. So obviously, uh, creating the all-white colony did not work, so to speak. But in any case, this leads to an attempt by Spain in the south and Florida, the French in the north and Quebec to overthrow the rule of London in the so-called colonies. But that leads to the so-called 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, where London is able to deliver a knockout blow to the French in Quebec and to the Spanish in Florida. But then this is where the traditional narrative kicks in, and also usually where our friends on the left arrive on the scene. I mean, you know, they're not too conversant with any history before 1756. That seems to be the starting point. That's where they pick up the story. With the 7 Years' War, then the English or the Londoners ask for more taxes. The settlers, as they are today, don't like to pay taxes. I guess they're too accustomed to people working for free on their behalf. And that plants the seeds of a revolt, helped along by the fact of the so-called proclamation line, where London expresses displeasure at continuing to move west, attacking Native American nations, and so that land speculators like George Washington can prevail. In my fall 2025 book, The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865, I'm able to get a peek at the last will and testament of George Washington, which I quote at length. And you won't believe the amount of land that this one guy controlled. For example, I mean, he makes Donald Trump look like a piker by way of comparison. His lineal descendant in more ways than one, or his lineal ancestor in more ways than one, to put it another way. In any case, that and increasing reliance on Black troops in the British Empire. You might be familiar with this Denzel Washington movie made early in his career. I think it's called For Queen and Country, where he plays a Black soldier in the red coat, for example. It's worth seeing. In any case, that leads to contradictions along with a mass movement in the British Isles against slavery. That plants the seeds for the revolt of 1776. And as I said before, it's not just Gerald Horne and Nicole Hannah-Jones that have been raising questions about 1776. Although, interestingly enough, it's been mostly Black intellectuals, for whatever reason, with the so-called white left counterattacking vigorously, in some ways de facto supporting the 1776 commission of one Donald J. Trump.